Hey, pushers. So, we've entered a new presidency. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, his VP LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, will become president. And here's the thing about uh, Lyndon Johnson. He was, as some historians note, a crass, gross, sweaty guy that no one really ever liked. And it's true. He didn't have the kind of personality that was effusive and drew people to him the way that Kennedy had. LBJ was kind of from mediocre beginnings, um, a southerner from Texas, and interestingly, probably the most liberal president that has ever uh, had a seat in the White House, like ever. He was more to the left than Obama, more to the left than Kennedy, more to the left than even Carter. He's probably, like I said, the most liberal president. And the thing was, when he took the presidency, he expected to be a domestic policy president. Unfortunately, however, events will happen that will force him to deal with the problem in Vietnam. And it has defined his presidency. Most people know him for his failings in Vietnam. And he was horrified watching his administration crumble in the wake of Vietnam. Now, this was a problem he inherited, but solely on LBJ's shoulders, he escalated it. And we'll get into the reasons why in just a moment. So, Vietnam, just to give you a little bit of playback, Vietnam actually began after World War II. In the 1950s, remember Eisenhower, when he went to the Geneva Convention to resolve the problems in Korea, where he negotiated an end to the Korean conflict, or at least an end in the terms of an armistice for the Korean conflict. There was another problem brewing, and that was Vietnam. So at the Geneva Convention in the 1950s, Eisenhower helped negotiate separating of Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam being controlled, at least temporarily, by communist Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam controlled by No Diem, who knows but wasn't communist, so that's what everyone cared about. So the idea was that these two separate countries would essentially, in the future, hold an election between Ho and No, and whoever wins, the reunification of Vietnam will take place under that leadership. But as the election was approaching, No was increasingly realizing he would never is going to win an election against the very popular Ho Chi Minh. So he began to pull back. The Kennedy administration's reaction to No and all of his non-democratic tendencies was to basically have a coup to overthrow him. The coup went oh so wrong in November 1963, and No, along with his brother, were killed in the attempted coup. That same month, Kennedy will also be assassinated. So when LBJ takes over, he is basically taking over a mess in South Vietnam. A U.S. CIA-led, essentially, assassination of No Diem. All right, and so at this point, Vietnam is going to be in the hands of LBJ, and realize the thing about LBJ is that he is so to the left, uncharacteristic for political Democrats, that he felt like he really needed to make a statement that he, as the President of the United States, a Democrat President of the United States, can be tough on communism, because he was seen as so left-wing. that he can take a stand, and he can be very anti-communist, and he can hold up the United States and continue the legacy of the United States being a superpower in the Cold War. But he needed an event that he could demonstrate. He could flex that muscle. He can show the world and the Russians that we were tough. So LBJ is going to look for a situation in which he can do that. And it turns out it was in Vietnam. In August 1964, LBJ announced that American destroyers, these are ships, that were patrolling here in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is a gulf, as you can see here, off the coast of Vietnam. These are considered to be international waters, meaning that everyone has a right to be there. But they were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. As a result, a destroyer of an American destroyer being attacked, LBJ goes before Congress and asks for not necessarily a declaration of war, but a blank check, so to speak, in which, and that is a slang term that refers to just being able to do whatever I want to do. So, hey, Congress, give me, the president, the authority to just handle the situation in the way that I think is best. It's called the Gulf-Tonkin Resolution, or the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Either way is fine. And it is basically a congressional blank check given to the president to do whatever it is he thinks is right. And so LBJ will proceed with that blank check. And his first, and of course he's talking with the military and all of the military advisors. And he figures, hey, this is a third world country, no big deal. We're just going to bomb the hell out of them, and then they will collapse like a house of cards. So Johnson begins essentially an active war in Vietnam with Operation Rolling Thunder. And Rolling Thunder was essentially bomb, 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 bomb. Now, there are two types of Vietnamese in this time period. There was the Viet Minh. These were North Vietnamese soldiers under Ho Chi Minh, thus the term Viet Minh, as in Ho Chi Minh. So this is Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnamese military, the Viet Minh. But then there's another group called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were also supporters of Ho Chi Minh. However, they were located in South Vietnam. So, we are allegedly defending South Vietnam from North Vietnam, right? We want to see a reunited Vietnam, but under non-communist control. So, Operation Rolling Thunder was sustained bombing of North Vietnamese targets, right? North Vietnamese targets. And so he figured, we just bomb North Vietnam and they will collapse. But that's not what happened. So once Operation Rolling Thunder happened and the North Vietnamese were not collapsing, Johnson ordered more bombing raids against North Vietnam and more U.S. troops into Vietnam, because that's what his military advisors were telling him. They were saying, hey, we just need a few more troops, a few more bombs. And essentially what happens over the course of the first few years of the Vietnam conflict following the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was what is known as fine-tuned escalation of U.S. forces. Slowly but surely, we're just going to add a few more troops. Add a few more troops. They're just a little bit more to defeat the enemy. But the issue was that what everyone seemed to misunderstand was the Vietnamese culture and the power and allure of Ho Chi Minh. And for every escalation, every soldier that we sent in addition, the enemy matched every increase with more man and guerrilla warfare. And so by the end of 1965, 184,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam, By 1968, which is the end of LBJ's administration, 500,000 troops were in Vietnam, and it cost about 30 billion annually to fight this war. Now, the South Vietnamese were fighting alongside American soldiers, those 184,000 by the end of 1965 and those 500,000 by the end of 1968. The South Vietnamese were fighting alongside U.S. soldiers, but as we are seeing from year to year to year, South Vietnam became spectators as the war became Americanized, taken over by U.S. boots on the ground, fought by U.S. soldiers against essentially the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong. Remember, the Viet Minh, that's easy. That's in North Vietnam. We're fighting North Vietnam. But the Viet Cong, this was in South Vietnam, and so we were fighting people within the territory that we're supposed to be protecting. And here's the thing about the Viet Cong. They were not military. These were just farmers by day and guerrilla soldiers by night. And so it's not like there were any uniforms. There wasn't any battlefields, right? It was guerrilla warfare. And so we couldn't tell the difference between civilians and the Viet Cong because civilians were the Viet Cong. So this became really ugly as U.S. soldiers just basically started to protect themselves, shooting what appeared to be civilians. And, you know, this is not the first time stuff like this has happened. Y'all remember the war in the Philippines. But here's the difference between the war in the Philippines and the war in Vietnam. Television. We got to see it. Now, you show Forrest and Jenny, U.S. soldiers going into villages in South Vietnam and blowing them up. And people are like, what is this? This isn't the American way. This isn't defending, liberty and justice. And this is like brutes attacking civilians. That's what it appeared to be. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's how it appeared to be. And perception oftentimes is reality. And so this war quickly became very unpopular. All right. So soon, U.S. justifications for the war. And again, LBJ was like, he couldn't relent. He couldn't show weakness. He couldn't, just turn tail because he needed to defend. He kind of doubled down instead of admitting, well, this was just a bad policy and a bad mistake. Instead, he doubled down. And he kept saying, we have to defend an important democratic ally in South Vietnam to demonstrate to the world the U.S.'s strength, its might, its commitment to containment. So what we see in LBJ is basically a continuation of JFK's flexible response. And if you don't remember what that was, that is, we're not going to use nuclear bombs. We're going to be flexible, and we're going to continue to use conventional weapons. And so Vietnam became a war of, yes, growing, escalating conventional weapons. And for every step that we took, the Vietnamese matched it. All right, and like I said, the difference between the Philippines and Vietnam was essentially television. It became a living room war. News showed U.S. troops burning huts and civilians burned with napalm. So here's another thing that was used. Vietnam is a densely foresty area, a lot of jungle, and Viet Cong would often hide, and then guerrilla-style tactics would surprise attack U.S. soldiers on patrol, and so in order to flush out the enemy, so they have no hiding places, we would essentially burn down forests, right? Burn down the jungle so they have no place to hide. We'd often use napalm to do that. We would also controversially use something called Agent Orange, which is essentially a Roundup, but worse. And we would spray this stuff all over all over plant matter, and so that it would die. We would also burn it. And napalm is like Agent Orange is it's like a dust, but napalm is like a gel. Napalm was often sprayed, and and then with gunfire it would ignite. And and here's some images. Some of them are disturbing about what people would see every night. Right here is Vietnamese civilians escaping an accidental napalm bombing on a village. You can see the smoke in the background. Right. Remember, at the time, the technology isn't as precise as it is today. So when planes overhead would spray napalm, sometimes they got it wrong because the technology for knowing where everything isn't exactly great. And U.S. soldiers setting fire to one of the huts in the Viet Cong training camp. Now, you would look at that and say, wait, that just looks like a regular civilian hut, right, in a regular Vietnamese village. But it was a Viet Cong training ground. So it's not like, soldiers were always doing the wrong thing. No, they were defending themselves and taking down the Viet Cong. But it just didn't play well on television. So as the body count increased, more and more American soldiers dying as a result of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong. There started to be some anti-Vietnam War protests. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Was often a protest chant. And again, LBJ is going to double down because he says, quote, I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went, right? Because of that domino effect. If Vietnam goes, then others may as well. So we see an escalation in terms of protest movements, particularly on college campuses. In 1965, we start to see the escalation of protest movements. Universities would hold what are known as teach-ins, and where, here's one at Rutgers, in which, there'd be a podium and everybody would listen to a speaker who would essentially talk about the wrongs that the administration are doing, and giving speeches, and everyone would sit around, would sit around and listen. And it was just basically kind of a style of protest. There were also marches. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets, as you can see here, an aerial view of Vietnam War demonstration at the Pentagon in 1967. Oftentimes, when police would come out to disperse, the chant would be, hell no, we won't go. There were also draft resistors who would, and I don't remember if I've mentioned this, the draft was instituted, so as more and more young men were being drafted towards this war. Now realize, here's the other big piece of anti-war protest. Not only is this different because it was televised, the war was essentially televised. It was put into the living room of your average American. But realize those who are being drafted, that's Jenny and Forrest. Jenny and Forrest are that generation, first ever to grow up middle class. Right? And if you grow up middle class, you have a certain sense of entitlement. You actually expect that your life is going to go well. And with that, you're not going to just give it up for some war, for some place you've never heard of. So we do see, unlike Joe and Rosie, who grew up unprivileged and believing they were dying for a noble cause in World War II, to Vietnam, Jenny and Forrest, who grew up middle class, entitled, and not wanting to give up their life for a non-worthy cause. So we do see, as you can see here, young men hold their burning draft cards up at an anti-war demonstration in front of the Pentagon. This is what a draft card looked like, and it was basically a lottery system. And if your number was called, then you had to report. So soon, not only do we have protests happening internally, it was also happening externally. World opinion turned against the U.S. because what it increasingly looked like as years passed, that a superpower was essentially bullying and bombing and blasting a tiny third world nation who is like David and Goliath, holding their own against a superpower. Several countries expelled U.S. Peace Corps volunteers. Remember, that was a program started by Kennedy, just to basically help, right? Kids would go in and teach people how to grow rice and how to start up businesses. But many countries expelled, just kicked out Peace Corps volunteers in a protest against U.S. actions in Vietnam. And even to France, who was very skeptical of the United States' rise to superpowerdom. In 1966, the French Premier Charles de Gaulle removed France from NATO. NATO, as you may recall, was an international organization largely started by the United States to combat communism and the Soviet Union. And so most of the Western world were members of NATO, but France, what was traditionally a strong ally for the United States, in protest for U.S. involvement in Vietnam, removed itself from NATO. All right, so by early 1968, this is towards the end of LBJ's administration, Vietnam became the longest and most unpopular war in U.S. history to date in 1968. Longer than World War II, longer than World War I. Right now, of course, we have passed that in Afghanistan currently, but in 1968, Vietnam had gone on longer than any other U.S. war. And as the war continues, people started going, why are we here again? How many years has it been? And they felt like the government didn't explain the rationale for why we were there. What was the goal? What were we trying to do? Like, what's our point of being there? Are we uniting Vietnam? Are we kicking out communists? What are we even doing there? And then as more and more people get drafted and more people die, people are starting to question, is it worth the price? Right? That we're fighting somebody else's war for them? And then Americans came to believe that they're being lied to by their government. And we start to see a real distrust in government emerge. I mean, Americans have always distrusted government. It's kind of how we started. But we also idolized our presidents, and we looked up to them. We may have criticized them, but at the end of the day, they were revered. That pretty much ends with LBJ. LBJ is going to be that president that that begins this deep distrust of the American people and its government. Whether it's rightful or not, that's what happens. And so we do see that theme really coming out in Vietnam. Johnson is seeing this. He's seeing the protests. He's seeing all this, and he is deeply, deeply concerned. And he feels like he needs to suppress dissent against the government. In 1967, Johnson ordered the CIA to spy on anti-war activists. He even ordered the FBI to use their intelligence programs against various types of anti-war movements, including peaceful movements, including civil rights movements, interestingly enough, because there was, to many, a very small line between anti-war protests and civil rights protests. So because of this deep distrust and growing opposition to the war, Congress launches this, an investigation. It's another congressional hearing here. In this case, the Senate is going to hold, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, a televised investigation starting in 1966 on what's going on in Vietnam. Like, why are we there? What is the government doing? Are they lying to us about things? And it was a series of public hearings, so it was all televised, to question a range of experts on the progress of the Vietnam War. It was chaired by Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas. You can see him here. And he basically chairs these investigations. And these hearings go on from 1966 and 1967, and prominent people were often brought before Congress to be questioned as a witness. You may recognize the guy on the left there. He's going to be a future presidential candidate, future Secretary of State. He, at the time, was a returning Vietnam veteran, won a Purple Heart while he was in Vietnam. And as soon as he got home, he began an anti-war protest movement. And so he was future Senator John Kerry. And he led an anti-war, and he had a lot of credibility at the time because he was a Purple Heart winner, just come back from Vietnam. So, who was really behind all of this fine-tuned escalation? It was probably Secretary of State Robert McNamara. He was JFK's Secretary of State, led us through the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of the foreign policy issues for JFK, and maintained his cabinet seat as Secretary of State under LBJ until now. Secretary McNamara expressed concerns and was quietly eased out of the cabinet. All right, meanwhile, Vietnam just goes to hell in a handbasket. Troop morale begins to decline. Sometimes troops in Vietnam, U.S. troops, would sabotage. They would mutiny. There was just unbelievable amounts of drug abuse. And there was even something called fragging. Fragging was when you took out a commanding officer who was very gung-ho about going in and doing missions. If they were very aggressive in taking on missions, let's go check out this village, let's go take out this village, some of the soldiers would basically sabotage or assassinate their commanding officer, tossing hand grenades or fragmentation grenades to put a stop to the aggressiveness, so that their lives wouldn't be put in peril by these aggressive commanders. So troop morale was really bad. Another incident that took place in 1968 was the My Lai massacre. So My Lai massacre was, as you can see from the bottom, it was not ordered by the highest level commanding officers. This was really a low level officer by the name of William Calley, who ordered his troop to essentially take out a village known as My Lai. And when they took out the village, U.S. soldiers killed all civilians, women, children, as well as other assaults that we will not go into detail about, were committed by U.S. soldiers. And of course, when this gets to the press, it is, again, where Americans are like, let's get these boys out of there. Look at this is not how we behave. Look what the war is doing to these troops. They're behaving in ways that aren't American. And so, war is hell, and we need to get them out of hell. All right, so evidence showed that the U.S. was fighting an Asian civil war against motivated rebels who were fighting an oppressive government. And that oppressive government was the U.S. And so again, as you can see, anti-war sentiment just increases. And meanwhile, Johnson clung to his original strategy of slowly ratcheting up pressure. And of course, he knows the unpopularity of it, so he chooses not to run for a second term. All right, so Vietnam topples Johnson and problems in the Middle East. 1968 is a big year. Not only do we have My Lai, but we also have the Tet Offense. The Tet Offense is it happened in that last year of fighting here in 1968. It was a communist simultaneous attack on 27 key South Vietnamese cities. You can kind of see the map right there. That's South Vietnam. Everywhere you see a little red bomb-looking thing, that was a targeted city. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and usually the festivities of celebrating the Vietnamese New Year included parades and all kinds of other festivities. And during those festivities, the Ho Chi Minh and his forces decided that in the middle of those festivities, they would go ahead and attack these cities. And so they did. They all opened fire in the middle of the Viet Cong, opened fire in the middle of all the festivities in these 27 different South Vietnamese cities. And of course, cameras caught it. And of course, on television, it looked like, oh my God, we're being attacked. South Vietnamese are being attacked. We're losing, we're losing, we're losing. And this is considered, Tet Offense is considered to be the turning point, popularity-wise in the war. This is pretty much the end, and there needs to be a retreat at this point. However, I will say U.S. forces successfully defeated the Viet Cong in the days after the Tet Offensive, but it was viewed very differently on television. So the importance of Tet is that it is a turning point. U.S. public opinion just says, okay, enough's enough. Military leaders did request of LBJ to send 200,000 more troops in 1968. Johnson agreed. So here is an example of the Tet Offense, just as kind of the thing that I wanted to show you that people were seeing on television. So you see this war-torn. This is the middle of one of the cities called Saigon in South Vietnam in the aftermath of Tet. And so they're, TV is capturing these images. And this does not look good for the Americans, right? Here's another Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. The photographer caught this moment. And what led up to this photograph was this young man right here. This young man was walking down the street. He started up right here. This is a South Vietnamese soldier, right? South Vietnamese soldier. All right, so this kid was walking down the street. Walking, and then this guy was walking towards him, right? And as soon as they crossed paths, as you can see here, the photographer caught it. This South Vietnamese soldier pulled a gun and shot this young man. And of course, that looks brutal. I mean, my God, here's South Vietnamese soldiers who are fighting alongside the Americans who are killing children. This looks like a kid, and this looks terrible. But here's what you don't know, and what television really doesn't portray. He was Viet Cong, right? He was a well-known, Viet Cong most wanted list kind of guy. And so that's what I mean by perception and reality. So as a result, in March 1968, Johnson makes a national televised address on the evening and says he will not seek, nor will he accept the nomination of his party for president. He will not run for a second term. But he will continue maintaining U.S. presence in Vietnam until the new election. Now, here's the thing. I know we've been vilifying LBJ, but like I said, he really was uber liberal, as you're going to see in our next video. And he had a big heart. Here he is sitting alone in the cabinet room listening to a tape-recorded message from his son-in-law about what it was like fighting in Vietnam. And he was torn up about it. I guess it doesn't matter. Actions are stronger than words. Okay, hopefully we're not going over time too badly. Let's talk about the Middle East. This is our last thing. Last we left the Middle East, I told you all that there was a war in the Middle East in every decade following World War II. There was one in the 1940s, remember the Arab-Israeli conflict. Then there was one in the 1950s called the Suez Crisis, and that was under Eisenhower. And the Suez Crisis, you remember, Egypt invades the Sinai, right, and attacks. Egypt invades the Sinai and closes the Suez Canal to Israel, right? So Israel then attacks Egypt. Israel essentially wins, and Egypt now has to demilitarize the Sinai Peninsula, right? So that happened in the 1950s. So the Sinai Peninsula right here is demilitarized, right? The UN is making sure that Egypt does not militarize the Sinai. Okay, that brings us to 1967 and what is going to be the war of the 1960s, and that is the Six-Day War in the Middle East. So May 1967, Egypt expels UN troops out of the Sinai that is supposed to be demilitarized, and then send 100,000 soldiers into the Sinai. So they are remilitarizing the Sinai Peninsula. Then it closes the Straits of Tiran to Egypt, right? The Straits of Tiran. I don't know if you can see where we are here. That's right here. And so when they do that, they block Israeli access to the Straits of Tiran. Jordan enters on the side of Egypt, and Israel's like, oh no. So they preemptively are going to send their Air Force, the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, to destroy most of the Egyptian Air Force. Then they turned east and pulverized the Jordanian Air Force, then the Syrian Air Force, and then the Iraqi Air Force. This happened in 6 days. The strike was the crucial element in Israel's victory. In 6 days, Israel wins. Right? So what was the fallout? The fallout is that Israel is now in control of the Sinai Peninsula, right? In control of the Gaza Strip, in control of the West Bank, eastern Jerusalem, as well as the Golan Heights. Remember, they took on Syria as well. This placed over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli control, and that is basically where things are going to stand until the next war, which will be in the 1970s. All right, that ends that. We'll pick this up next video. See you guys later.